They're medical wildcats. I'm Joseph Guggenheim. I'm a 1972 alum of the medical school. And this month, my presentation is on the movie industry in Chicago. I call it Hollywood on the Lake, a tribute to John Hughes. Perhaps no other screenwriter, producer, and director had more of an impact on movies in Chicago, or perhaps even the United States, than John Hughes. He went to high school in this area, he lived here, he raised his family here, and he made many of his movies here. Before there was Hollywood, there was Chicago. In the early 20th century, one-fifth of all the movies in the world was made in Chicago. Chicago had more movie theaters per capita than any other city in the country. The first movie theater was in Chicago. The public could just not get enough of this entertainment medium. And then after about 20 or 30 years, the movie industry packed up and went to Hollywood for several reasons. We will look at these reasons. So between 1920 and about 1980, there were a few important movies made in Chicago, but it wasn't until 1980 that Chicago regained its prominence in the movie industry, largely due to John Hughes. So let's look at the movie industry. John Hughes gave us many characters that we'll never forget. There was Ferris Bueller and his high school friends who played hooky in order to see downtown Chicago and a Cubs game. And then there was Samantha Baker, whose parents forgot her 16th birthday because it coincided with her sister's wedding date. And then there were the characters portrayed by Steve Martin and John Candy, who were trying to get home to Chicago for Thanksgiving in bad weather. And who can ever forget Ben Stein checking attendance in his economics class in Ferris Bueller's Day Off? And in Weird Science, two high school computer geeks were trying to make the perfect woman. And then Home Alone, the highest grossing comedy of all times. John and Nancy Hughes were major philanthropists. They realized the importance of giving something back to the Chicago area, and they understood the importance of research and patient care and education for future physicians. They were very generous toward Northwestern. They gave the 255-seat Hughes Auditorium to the medical school, the largest auditorium on the campus. They endowed a distinguished professorship in rheumatology. They were generous to Northwestern Medicine hospitals, donating Mrs. Hughes donated that family home to the Lake Forest Hospital after the passing of Mr. Hughes. There's a pavilion at the Lake Forest Hospital named in their honor. So let's look at the movie industry. The early movie projectors were developed by Edward Muybridge, an eccentric British photographer, and the Lumiere brothers of France. Muybridge called his projector the Zoopraxiscope. He was hired by Leland Stanford, the founder of Stanford University, to investigate whether a racehorse, which Mr. Stanford owned, ever had all four legs off the ground at the same time in a normal gait. Before that time, horses running were usually depicted with a at least 1 foot on the ground. As seen in this top row of high-speed photographs, there is a period in a normal horse's gait where all four legs are off the ground. Muybridge took these high-speed photographs, put them on a round glass disc like a phonograph record, and could show movies that made it look like the horse was running. He did this for other animals as well as humans walking. The Lumiere brothers of France devised a device which was a combination camera, printer, and projector. They called it the cinematography. The first movie theater was probably in the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The first movie filmed in Chicago was Chicago Police Parade in 1897. It was a 45-second film of the policemen marching. Alexandre Promio shot the film, and he aimed the camera at 45 degrees to the line of progression of the policemen to maximize the appearance of movement. The Lumiere brothers sent their cinematographers all over the world to take advantage of this popularity of the new medium. Thomas Edison thought that movies were probably just a toy, but he invented a device called the kinetoscope or kinetograph to show moving pictures. It was scheduled to be introduced at the 1893 World's Fair. Unfortunately, it did not arrive in time until 1894. You can see the picture on the right. It has a port in the top where one viewer can look in the hole and see this long loop of film that goes round and round, back and forth to make a movie. By the early 1900s, Chicago had more movie theaters per capita than any other U.S. city. And many of those were these single viewer type device, but gradually they were replaced by the auditorium type movie theater. By the late 1910s, one out of every five movies in the United States was made in Chicago. There were two great movie picture studios in Chicago at the turn of the century. The first was Selig Polyscope. Colonel William Selig was a vaudeville magician and he organized traveling shows. He sometimes called himself Colonel and sometimes called himself Professor. We do not know about what his academic and military background was. He saw one of Edison's kinetoscopes at a fair in Dallas in 1894 and became obsessed with moving pictures. He realized that the big bucks in the movie industry were to be made by filling theaters and not by making movies. He attempted to improve on the Lumiere projector and he made his own device. He established a Chicago film studio in the northwest part of Chicago, northwest at the time, at Irving Park Road and Western Avenue. He recreated Teddy Roosevelt's African safari with a live lion shooting, which killed the lion in the Chicago studio. Fortunately, this kind of thing is not allowed anymore. He realized there were problems with shooting movies in the Chicago area. One was the weather, and another one was sometimes you could see laundry flapping in the background of his movies. He was the first filmmaker to set up a studio in the Los Angeles area. He used ethnic actors to correspond to the stereotypes of the time. He filmed one film which was supposed to be set in the Sahara Desert at the Indiana Dunes in northern Indiana. He used the yacht basin at Jackson Park left over from the 1893 fair for a movie about Christopher Columbus. There were several problems. Actors became seasick. The Santa Maria was stranded on a sandbar, and curious Chicagoans in small boats rowed their boats out to watch the filming of the movie. S&A came along about 11 years later, 1907. It was Chicago's second great motion picture studio. It began as the Peerless Film Company, and then it became S&A. It was founded by George Spoor and Gilbert M. Bronco Billy Anderson, a Western star who could not ride a horse. The name S&A was derived from the S in Spoor and the A in Anderson to make S&A. The studio was located on West Argyle Street. The building still stands and it has this fancy door. They closed it down in 1916, but now it is part of St. Augustine College. Spoor was a newspaper vendor and box office manager for the Waukegan Opera House. He teamed up with Edward Ames to invent a projector called the Magnascope to project an image on a flat surface. He too realized that the big bucks were to be made by filling theaters and not by actually making movies. He later worked on a widescreen 3D projection. His partner was William G. Anderson. He was born Maxwell Henry Aronson. Sometimes his name was written William G., sometimes M. Anderson, sometimes G. M. Anderson, and sometimes Bronco, spelled C-H-O. Anderson had previously worked for Edison before coming over to S&A. In one film, he played three parts. He played a robber, a passenger, and a man made to dance on a train in The Great Train Robbery. He left Edison to join Selig in 1905 to direct and act in his own westerns. One of S&A's early stars was Ben Turpin, who was cross-eyed. He starred in the movie An Awful Skate or Hobo on Rollers. This was the first S&A film and it was made in 1907. It was filmed on Wells Street. It was a picture of a very clumsy man trying to roller skate down the street. The first pie in the face gag was done in a movie made in Chicago, Mr. Flip, in 1909. This was the first pie in the face gag that had been done in a movie. It had been used in vaudeville films, vaudeville shows, but not in a movie until Mr. Flip. Charlie Chaplin worked for S&A briefly. Anderson realized the talent that Charlie Chaplin had and brought him to Chicago. Chaplin was promised $10,000 signing bonus and $1,250 a week. When he arrived, he lived at the Anderson's apartment on West Lawrence. At first, he said, "I think I'm going to like it here. Nice people, nice studio." However, he had the problem of arriving in late December 1914, and we all know what the weather can be like then. The Andersons took him to a fancy New Year's Eve celebration, and instead of putting a scarf around his neck, he wrapped his pajama bottoms around his neck. He made only one film in Chicago, and the title of the film was His First Job. He often ignored the script and inserted his own brand of vaudeville improvisation. He left after less than 2 months, complaining Chicago was too cold. Spoor refused to pay him what he had been promised because he said he was not worth it, and he also refused to meet with him face to face. So Chaplin left. But by 1915, he was the highest paid actor in the world. SNA left Chicago for California. They closed in 1918, and this is a picture of their California studio. They were later absorbed by Warner Brothers. Race films were done in approximately 1920. Early silent films often showed African Americans playing jungle natives, comic buffoons, porters, and maids. But entrepreneurs wanted to produce their own films to show a more accurate reflection of African Americans. So these race films were made. Unfortunately, they were hampered by low budget, crude technical aspects, and most have been lost. Studios popped up on Chicago's South Side. Foster Photoplay was the first. In 1912, William Foster directed the first movie thought to be made with an all-black cast, The Railroad Porter. In 1913, Foster opened the first African-American owned and operated film studio in the U.S. on South State Street. He made 2 real films, which were considered long films at the time. The first all-black feature film was The Homesteader, produced and directed by Oscar Micheaux in the abandoned Selig Polyscope studio in 1919. Micheaux was regarded as the first major African-American feature filmmaker. He was the most successful African-American filmmaker of the first half of the 20th century. He was, like John Hughes, he was considered a brilliant storyteller, story writer, producer, and director. He produced more than 40 films and wrote 7 novels. He made both silent and talkie films. His films were thought-provoking regarding racial issues. In 1918, Micheaux opened the Micheaux Film and Book Studio on South Dearborn. And he was a natural storyteller, but unfortunately, his film suffered from poor lighting, choppy editing, and technical blunders. He was criticized for portraying light-skinned African Americans in heroic roles and darker members of the race as villains. He died in 1951, and his gravestone reads, "A man ahead of his time." But as I said, like John Hughes, he was considered a brilliant writer, producer, and director. Perhaps his most important film was Within Our Gates, released in 1920. This was inspired by D.W. Griffin's The Birth of a Nation and the Chicago race riots of 1919. It was the story of Sylvia Landry, a wealthy African-American woman who dedicated her life to a nearly bankrupt school for impoverished Black children. It was considered a historic landmark in Chicago filmmaking, written, directed, and produced by Micheaux. By the early 1900s, Chicago had more film theaters per capita than any U.S. city. And Chicago was the home of the largest theater chain, Balaban and Katz. They had 50 theaters in Chicago. They had elaborate movie palaces, as shown on the right. This is the Chicago Theater, which is still intact in the West Loop area. And they have 2 theaters in Chicago still present, the Oriental, which is now the Nederlander, which shows traveling Broadway shows, and Chicago Theater, which is used for special events. None of their theaters are currently used for actually showing movies on a regular basis. There's an Uptown Theater, which was used as the setting for the toy store scene in Home Alone 2. But otherwise, the buildings that are still in existence are not showing movies. Balaban and Katz was later affiliated with Paramount, but the movie theaters were very popular because the clients were seated by uniformed ushers with white gloves. And then the 1920s came along. With the advent of talkies, the studios packed up and moved to California, with very few films shot in Chicago anymore. Chicago remained an important distribution center despite the departure of the studios, and South Wabash was known as Film Row. Several of the movie companies, MGM, Columbia, Warner Brothers, and Paramount, had offices there, as well as companies that made theater seating, posters, and concessions. More than 15 film exchanges were operating in the U.S., which controlled 80% of the film distribution in our country. But in the 1920s, the film industry in Chicago declined due to several reasons. The weather, well, that's self-explanatory. the advent of talkies, which required different equipment, and the Motion Picture Patents Company and censorship. The Motion Picture Patents Company, also known as the Edison's Trust, was organized by Thomas Edison in 1909. He wanted to eliminate competition and control the movie industry from the cameras to the projectors. Licensing was enforced by violent goon and mob tactics. So what some of the studios did was they just packed up and moved to California, where the licensing enforcement was more lax. The Justice Department dissolved the MPPC in 1915, saying it was a monopoly. Film censorship was also something that chased off the industry. There's a legend that Mayor Richard J. Daley was responsible for censorship. There's a legend that he saw a film or TV show which did not depict his beloved city very nicely, so he forbade any movie or TV filming after that. This is not true because censorship began before Daley and continued after his death. Chicago was one of the first cities to initiate censorship, and it was done by a police board starting in 1907. The Illinois and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the city's right to censor, saying that the movie industry was an industry and not an art form. Permits were issued to the movies to exhibit them, and they were issued by the police. Pink-colored permits were issued to movies that were deemed suitable for adults only. So the pink-colored permits attracted a certain audience. The Motion Picture Commission in Chicago held hearings in 1918 and 1919 to find out the effects of movies. The movies at that time were blamed on the decline of traditional family values, cigarette smoking, premature interest in the opposite sex, children becoming rebellious toward their parents, delinquency, and one physician even testified that movies damaged the developing delicate nerve centers in growing children. One witness testified that school children could identify more movie stars in the movies than figures in The Last Supper. And the sensational film content and dimly lit quarters in theaters were blamed for intimate relations. In 1920, the commission issued a report almost 200 pages in length. They still continued censorship, but they wanted to eliminate the objection of words censor and censorship because of the negative connotation. The Film Review Board, which consisted of police, was replaced by a salaried board. The board continued its work until 1984, although after about 1970, they did very little. A film genre called film noir became popular in the 1940s and 50s. These films had many things in common: black and white, low budget, night scenes, rain-slicked streets, neon signs, men in fedora hats smoking cigarettes, low camera angles, etc. Two of these made largely in Chicago were City That Never Sleeps and Call Northside 777. Call Northside 777 was filmed in several locations in Chicago, including the Merchandise Mart and the Wrigley Building as seen in this top picture. The lower picture shows an office in the Wrigley Building with the Tribune Tower in the background. City That Never Sleeps was made in both Chicago and Los Angeles. The upper black and white picture shows a scene from the movie in the Marquette Building lobby, and the lower picture shows what the Marquette Building looks like today. It's almost identical. In 1950, a low-budget black and white film was made in these three locations. Can you name the film and that star? It was one of our Northwestern alums, Charlton Heston, who played the part of Mark Antony and got his classmates to play the other roles. He made another movie about Julius Caesar in 1970, also playing Mark Antony. His first film was made at the Elks Memorial on Lakeview and Lakeshore Drive, Soldier Field, and the Museum of Science and Industry because of the architectural columns at these sites. There were a few important movies made between 1920 and 1980, but it was not until 1980 that Chicago regained its prominence in the film industry, largely due to financial incentives by the city and the state. Since 1980, more than 1,100 films have been made in Chicago. The movie musical Chicago was actually filmed in Toronto. There were several important films that were made in 1980, and this began a resurgence of the film industry. Blues Brothers, Ordinary People, Risky Business in 1983, and the John Hughes era began in the 80s. His first film was National Lampoon's Class Reunion, which was not very well received by the critics or by his audiences. But then he wrote several blockbusters, including 16 Candles, which he wrote and directed, released in 1984. Two of the 1980 films were The Blues Brothers with John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd, made in 1980. It received a Golden Reel Award for the quality of the movie. Ordinary People was awarded a Academy Award for Best Movie of the Year, and Robert Redford received the Best Director of the Year. It starred Donald Sutherland and Mary Tyler Moore. The Blues Brothers had no computer imaging. The Bluesmobile was driven 118 miles an hour under the L tracks in the loop. And there were other high-speed films that were made, other high-speed scenes made on Lower Wacker Drive in Lower Michigan. There were several stars that had brief cameo appearances. It was one of the most expensive films ever made, costing $30 million, most expensive at the time. It is in the National Film Registry in the Library of Congress as a culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant film. There were 103 automobiles, including old police cars, and 12 Bluesmobiles that were destroyed in the filming. And there were many stars, some of them having very small cameo parts, including Paul Reubens, better known as Pee Wee Herman. Steven Spielberg had a very brief cameo part, so did Twiggy. And John Landis, who co-wrote and produced the movie, inserted himself in the movie at one point. Ordinary People is the story of the Jarrett family. It was filmed in Highland Park. There's a scene at a gazebo in Lake Bluff. There were outdoor scenes in Lake Forest, shopping center scene at Neiman Marcus in Northbrook. There's a scene which was set in a Houston golf course, which was actually filmed in California, and a scene that was made at the Walker Brothers' original pancake house in Wilmette. The teenage genre became popular in the mid-20th century. American International produced many beach party movies between 1963 and 87. Many of these were the Frankie and Annette beach party movies. American Graffiti is the story of teenagers around their high school graduation. National Lampoon was a story of college fraternities. It wasn't until John Hughes came along that the film industry underwent a major revision. He was a brilliant screenwriter, director, and producer. The picture on the left shows him in his younger years, and the picture on the right was made at his home in Lake Forest when several representatives from Northwestern went to interview him. He granted very few interviews in his life. He vowed to change the teenage genre. He said, when I came along, Hollywood's idea of teen movies meant there had to be a lot of nudity, usually involving boys in pursuit of sex, and pretty gross overall. He was going to change this. Most of his movies largely showed teenagers coming of age or the relationship between the various groups, the geeks and the jocks, the high income and the low income groups, etc. So let's get together again next month virtually, and I'll talk about John Hughes' career as well as the Chicago movie industry since his passing. And this picture shows his personal friends, John Candy and Steve Martin, who loved Mr. Hughes. In the meantime, have a happy Thanksgiving. Stay healthy, stay connected with each other, and I look forward to our virtual meeting again next month.